Thank you very much, Professor Eva Wróblewska-Trochimiuk, and thanks also to Professor Maciej Falski, and I want to thank also Austrian Cultural Forum for this opportunity to be here. I'm really honored and thrilled to be here to share my research with you, and my research is about Rijeka, or Fiume, in the aftermath of the First World War. So here you have the map, which can help us visualize the region we are discussing. So here we can see the kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. It may happen that sometimes I will say Yugoslavia. Of course, it was not named Yugoslavia before 1929, but it was already known popularly as Yugoslavia, created in December 1918, and its borders. And in this detailed section, we can see the border area between the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes and Italy, with the unsolved problem of Rijeka or Fiume. Both states wanted to annex the city to their territories, and this is the dispute I will describe today from above, or the perspective of historical events from 1918 to 1920, and from below, or the perspective of the people, the borderlands communities, which is the common topic of this series of lectures. I must give you some preliminary notes about this city. The city's name in Croatian is Rijeka, which means river, while in Italian it's called Fiume, which means the same thing. And in English, when speaking in English, we can use both terms, Rijeka or Fiume. Different authors make different choices. I think, mostly use the name Rijeka, even if it is possible that I will sometimes say Fiume, so it's the same thing. At the turn of the century, Rijeka was home to people of many nationalities, and also to people who did not have a specific sense of national belonging. We will discuss it deeply more after. And many languages were spoken here, including the four most frequent languages were Italian, Croatian, German, and Hungarian. And the majority of people were multilingual for practical, everyday reasons. And there was a nice local saying, supposedly from the turn of the 20th century, El più stupido uomo parla quattro lingue. The most stupid man speaks 4 languages, because it was really a basic knowledge for everyday survival in the city. One more preliminary note. You have seen this picture on the poster of our lecture of today. So when I refer to Rijeka or Fiume, I mean the city center located to the west of the Riječina River. Historically, this was the so-called corpus separatum since 18th century, an urban area with a specific status within the Habsburg monarchy. For the most part of 19th century, it was considered as part of Hungarian kingdom, but they had their own representative in Croatian parliament, and the main language spoken in city administration was Italian. So the situation was quite complicated, a kind of exception in the monarchy and a privilege given to the city, and the citizens were proud of this, of their free port and of their local specificity. And their main occupations were business, trade, navigation. There was a growing bourgeoisie in this period, and during the 19th century, the city was really developing very fastly. This photo is from the interwar period, but it shows very clearly that to the west of the river there was Fiume, the corpus separatum I mentioned before. But on the east of the river there was another city, Sušak, which during the Habsburg monarchy was part of Habsburg Kingdom of Croatia, Slovenia, which was also Hungarian links, but so both parts of the city were Hungarian, but not in the same sense. But the population in Sušak was primarily Croatian. And although the two cities had separate administrations, as I said, there was a continuous exchange of people and goods between them before the end of the empire. But between the two world wars, the western zone, Fiume, was part of Italy, and the eastern zone, Sušak, became part of Yugoslavia, with the border passing right through the city, as shown in this photo. After the World War II, the two sides were united into one city in Yugoslavia, as it is today, in Croatia, with the river in the middle. So this is the city of Rijeka today. Our lecture today will have more or less this structure. So I have to say that my research is not a historical study. I'm a literary historian, and from the methodological point of view here, I combine memory studies, history of emotions, and literary anthropology. In the first part of this lecture, I will give you a brief overview on what happened in the city of Rijeka at the end of World War I, when paramilitary troops led by Italian poet and soldier Gabriele D'Annunzio occupied the city with the aim of annexing it to Italy. Secondly, I will discuss how this period has been remembered up to the present day. And this is very important because what happened in Rijeka in 1919 remains a matter of political debate and even a source of diplomatic tensions between Italy and Croatia. And furthermore, it regards some of our today's deepest concerns, like how to deal with populist leaders and proto-fascist or post-fascist or neo-fascist manipulators of public opinion. So it's really a topic that concerns us today very vividly. My third question is the following. So during my research on the memory of D'Annunzio's occupation of Rijeka, I noticed that historical accounts focus heavily on the emotions of D'Annunzio's followers, the so-called arditi or legionaries. I will call them legionaries, depicting them as enthusiastic and brave young people who identify deeply and unquestionably as Italian. As a result, the official history of the event is filled with emotions, but always from the perspective of the legionaries. In contrast, I wanted to explore the emotions of Rijeka's inhabitants who opposed the annexation to Italy, mainly Croatians or pro-Yugoslavs. I examined their emotions through their narrative expressions, so I worked on text, on narrative text. I questioned what words did they use and how these words reflect their feelings, especially their sense of national belonging. So emotions, national belonging, and text, words. And what I wanted to understand was if this sense of national belonging was such a clear-cut emotion that can always be expressed in superlatives like Italianissimo, or legionaries were Italianissimi. So can we say the same for non-Italians in Rijeka at the time, or for all Italians in Rijeka at the time? Is it always such a clear-cut emotion? So these will be 3 main chapters of my lecture. So first, briefly, some historical background. At the end of the First World War, much of Italian public opinion was deeply dissatisfied with the outcome of the Paris Peace Treaty. You know that Italy was on the winning side, but nevertheless, Italian population displayed symptoms of what Wolfgang Schivelbusch, who calls a culture of defeat. Disappointment with the new borders that did not meet Italian territorial expectations, depression, a sense of moral superiority, nihilism, desire for revenge. One phrase captured this feeling, and it was mutilated victory, vittoria mutilata. And it was coined by the famous Italian poet and soldier Gabriele D'Annunzio. Under this phrase, different political, paramilitary, artistic, and intellectual groups gathered. Futurists were among them. They glorified war, were ready to continue fighting. They disdained the liberal state which was being formed at the war's end. They refused parliamentary democracy as boring and petty bourgeois. And this discontent created fertile ground for the rise of fascism. The border between Italy and the new state of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes was left unresolved by the peace treaty, leaving the status of Rijeka open, which was a typical solution by League of Nations, and this situation might sound familiar to you from many cases, in similar cases in your region. Danzig, for example, is often compared to Fiume in this case. And it seems as a good solution for the League of Nations to avoid complex national claims, but it never resulted in peaceful result or solution. So for these young paramilitaries I mentioned before, the slow, diplomatic and peaceful solutions proposed for Rijeka were frustrating, and their frustration found an outlet in the occupation of the city, which was an act that went against the wishes of the Italian government, at least formal or legal or public wishes, against the League of Nations and against the peace treaty. And they choose D'Annunzio to lead their provocative military action. On September 12th of 1919, D'Annunzio and his legionaries entered Rijeka, where they were welcomed by residents who supported the city's annexation to Italy. That was one part of the population of the city. Most of the others, actually the majority, just watched the spectacle. Because the occupation actually took on the character of a theater show. D'Annunzio's followers were often extravagant, bizarre. They promoted free love, drug use, and displayed a contempt for danger and death, close to D'Annunzio's own nihilistic pose. And D'Annunzio himself used the occupation to experiment with a new form of rule based on his cult of personality. Populism, mass gatherings, speeches from balconies, the Roman salute, and some of these elements would later be adopted by Mussolini, who was his political rival at the time. D'Annunzio's nationalist rhetoric, intended to inflame the masses, included mysticism, euphoria, the exaltation of martyrdom, and the use of Catholic symbols and rituals to promote hatred and violence. And the libertarianism of his followers, I mentioned before, was tied to their sense of superiority over Rijeka's inhabitants, workers, women, Croats, pro-Yugoslav peasants, and others, which often took the form of arrogance and came together with violence. So it's clear that that colorful, theatrical, spectacular side of this occupation shouldn't hide its darker aspects. Because from the start, D'Annunzio's regime persecuted political opponents by destroying their shops, burning their ships, firing workers, denying business permits, and more and more. It is true when historians say that there were not so many casualties as we could expect, given the quantity of weapons and the arrogance and lack of discipline among the soldiers. But still, if we do not consider the number of killed people as the only indicator of the level of violence, there was quite enough violence in Rijeka under D'Annunzio, and it took many forms: anti-Slavic racism, discrimination, expulsion, intimidation, and fear, resulting in mass exile. And we will talk later about the community of exiles who went to Zagreb and published a journal I will speak about. So besides the annexation, the political option of annexation to Italy, supported by one part of the population in Rijeka, there were two other main political options: annexation to the state of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and maintaining Rijeka's autonomy, which was a form of regionalism that the city had enjoyed in its best days under the empire. And supporters of both alternatives were persecuted, so also regionalists or autonomists were persecuted. And the occupation lasted 14 months. On the Christmas Day 1920, during the so-called Bloody Christmas, the Italian Navy attacked D'Annunzio's forces in the city, causing casualties among his soldiers and civilians, and eventually forcing D'Annunzio and his followers to leave. So for all the time during the occupation, he was repeating fiume o morte, fiume or death, but at the end he retired in a luxury villa on Lago di Garda. After D'Annunzio left, Rijeka remained autonomous for a very short time, and in 1924 it was annexed to the fascist Italy, and it is clear that D'Annunzio's occupation in 1919 paved the way for this outcome. I will show you some photos here. They loved posing, and there were several photographs among them. Propaganda was part of D'Annunzio's political program. He was very good at it. And there is a large archive of these staged images. Here we can see D'Annunzio and his legionaries. Here you can notice the knives in their mouths and how this soldier is displaying the gun. And this one is particularly striking because legionaries, again, have knives in their mouths. They are surrounded by citizens, civilians, children, with a little girl in white dress and a flag on the center, and it seems that they're having fun. And this is really a powerful illustration of the madness, I would say, of that times. So, of course, this is a short period, a short episode in history, but as you can see, paradigmatic one for post-World War I period. It is also an episode that still resonates strongly today. And this is my second question, the memory of D'Annunzio's occupation. During the fascist era, D'Annunzio's occupation of Rijeka was celebrated as a precursor to fascism. After World War II, Italian anti-fascist historiography agreed with this interpretation, but with a critical stance, seeing it as a kind of foreshadowing of the fascist march on Rome in 1922. But in the 1960s, new approaches emerged. Historians from both the left and the right explored the idea that the legionaries' intentions were more libertarian and politically confused than a simple announcement of totalitarianism. These historians focused on documents which, according to them, proved that their political beliefs were, the legionaries' political beliefs were a mix of anarchism, socialism, syndicalism, disdain for parliamentary democracy, skepticism toward international organizations like the League of Nations and so on. This was actually very similar to the formative phase of fascism. Fascism was not immediately a totalitarian regime, well organized and so on. At its first phase in 1919, 1920, fascism was a chaotic mix of ideas, the raw material from which later fascism developed. It, of course, already contained seeds of future fascist principles like racism, imperialism, militarism, violence, and the cult of personality. However, it also included ideas commonly associated with the left. And you know that Mussolini began as a socialist. And legionaries in Rijeka, some of them, supported also universal suffrage, women's emancipation, egalitarianism. So these ideas were, as you can see, contradictory and confusing. They were held together by D'Annunzio's ambiguous rhetoric, which somehow always circled back to Italian nationalism and civilizational supremacy. But in the 60s, some historians, influenced by the American and French students' movements, compared D'Annunzio's legionaries to the hippies of their era, interpreting the occupation as a kind of hippie revolution. And the concept of revolution was indeed present among the legionaries themselves, though they viewed Rijeka not as a Bolshevik revolution. They knew about the Bolshevik Revolution and they were influenced somehow by Bolshevik Revolution, but they said, no, we are better than Bolshevik Revolution. We are a unique, elegant, we are Latin-style revolution. Not so strict, so serious, so dictatorial. We are more relaxed. But with corporativism, instead of class struggle. So while in Bolshevik Revolution we have, of course, based on class struggle, the idea of the legionaries is corporativism, which is another clear link to fascism. This 1960s interpretation was appealing but not fully accepted during the Cold War. D'Annunzio's occupation was still primarily viewed as precursor to fascism. And this changed when? In the 90s, with the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the post-communist era, when D'Annunzio's revolutionary myth regained appeal. Both the political right and left found reasons to embrace it. For the political right, the myth of the Nuncio's revolution serves as a way to mask fascist sympathies and irredentist aspirations. You know what irredentist means. This refers to irredentism, Italian claims to areas they consider historically Italian, like Istria, Rijeka, and the Adriatic coast. Many Italian historians still see the Nuncio's occupation as the completion of the Risorgimento, as the Nuncio himself said. The completion of Risorgimento, which unified the Italian state, just some pieces left still missing. So the Nuncio completed it, the final piece of Italy's unification. And with the far right in power in Italy today, as you know, we have far-right government since 1922. These territorial aspirations are now openly expressed. For instance, on October 26th of this year, less than a month ago, at the celebration of Trieste's return to Italy, Senate President Ignazio La Russa said, Trieste in 1954 finally joined its motherland, but unfortunately not the other parts of the Adriatic coast that were equally Italian, like Istria, Fiume, and Dalmatia. So as a public declaration, this is quite a strong, because it means such statements imply that Italy's eastern border could still be reconsidered today. So the Nuncio provides a convenient symbol for these aspirations, because his enterprise, as they call it, happened before the founding of the fascist party, so his memory seems less overtly fascist. It was before fascism. And in addition, as I mentioned, his operation was portrayed as anti-totalitarian, anti-globalist, a blend of right and left, representing a happy revolution, and a political overturn leading to conservatism, which is all very close to the populist ideas of today. And this is why he became so famous and so regained popularity after the 90s. On the far left, there is a fascination with the legionaries' perceived anti-globalism and libertarianism and avant-garde artistic ideas. And today's anti-globalists sometimes identified with the Nuncio's statements against world political and economic powers, although it is clear that the Nuncio's statements served only to disguise the imperialistic course of the occupation. In the last decade, and especially as the 100th anniversary approached in the 2019, the idea of the Nuncio's occupation as a light revolution, a holiday time, or a kind of happy suspension of time, has gained popularity. And the Italian city of Trieste, is the closest and the most comparable to Rijeka, held celebrations for the centennial, including the unveiling of a statue, an exhibition full of military artifacts and nationalist symbols, and so on. And meanwhile, in Rijeka, in Croatia, historians and curators responded by highlighting the negative aspects of the occupation, such as the Nuncio's anti-Slavic racism and the impact on local residents. And this led to a kind of rivalry between the two cities. And this tension became visible on September the 12th, 2019, when Italian far-right neo-fascist activists carried out provocations in Rijeka during the anniversary events. And everybody could have expected it, but everybody seemed to be surprised, as if it came out of blue. And it was really clear that all the celebration of happy revolution was leading directly towards neo-fascist nostalgia. And And interestingly, in this memory war between Trieste and Fiume and Rijeka, Trieste had strong support from the Italian state, while Rijeka received minimal attention from the Croatian government, which saw it as a local issue. It doesn't interest us. And someone wittily pointed out that if Serbian politicians or public personalities had made such claims about Croatian territory, there would have been an uproar in Zagreb. But because it came from Italians and the Italian government, political collaboration took priority. So it's also interesting to remember that some Croatian conceptual artists, because Rijeka was European Capital of Culture in 2020, and some Croatian Rijeka's conceptual artists embraced the myth of the Nuncio's anti-globalism and proposed performances celebrating his occupation as part of 2020 European Capital of Culture events, so linking directly D'Annunzio and European values, a total nonsense. A recent artistic response to these ambiguities is something very interesting. This is a mockumentary film by director Igor Bezinovic, which will be premiere at the Rotterdam Film Festival in February 2025. It has not been premiered yet. And he uses reenactments of historical photos. I told you that there is a huge archive of historical staged photos. So he uses the method, the tool of reenacting these photos. And also he uses humoristic portrayal of the cult of D'Annunzio, the way that he makes several people taking the role of D'Annunzio, so he makes a kind of confusion and hilarious. The film is really, at some points, is hilarious. And on some points, he also includes scenes from today's Casa Pound. Casa Pound is neo-fascist Italian organization. So he highlights the direct connection between early fascist ideas, their nefarious historical evolution, and eventually their present-day manifestations. Meanwhile, in Italy, the misleading interpretation of the Happy Revolution continues to persist. 2 weeks ago, in Udine, where I work, I came across a film set, which was clearly about Rijeka and D'Annunzio. And obviously, I approached the film crew and I asked them what was it about, and I understood. I learned from them that it is a Rhine national television production of a TV film celebrating D'Annunzio's occupation of Rijeka. The plot has elements of a spy story. There is an Italian woman who works as a spy for Bolshevik Russia and arrives in Rijeka to investigate an attempted assassination of D'Annunzio, and naturally she falls in love with a legionary, and so on and so on. So this is melodramatic, a historical, I dare say, stupid plot, which is typical of recent Rai productions aimed at broad audience. They want to capture the attention. They want to influence the public opinion. So this is really a kind of Gramscian national popular culture intended to achieve what Gramsci said, called cultural hegemony, but this time it's right-wing hegemony, differently from Gramsci's original meaning. So this is popular culture that spreads ideas that can easily, in some funny forms, and encounter the public and influence the public opinion. And in this plot, we find all the elements of the Nuncio revolutionary myth. Even a connection to Bolshevik revolution is included. However, I noticed, and I watched carefully all the set, and I noticed an interesting detail in the set design. On a poster on the wall, a mention of the first fascist organization founded in Rijeka. There was proto-fascist organization, small fascist organization before fascist party. And one of them was founded in Rijeka in 1919. This detail has never previously appeared in the interpretations of the Nuncio's Happy Revolution. They never mentioned that there was fascist organization, proto-fascist organization in Rijeka. And I see it as a step forward. In today's Italy, we seem to be moving toward the normalization and even a proud acknowledgement of the fascist past. So we can go on and pass to the discussion about national belonging and the sense of national belonging. As we can see, this debate over memory is centered around national and territorial issues. And this is central to traditional historiography, and for a long time this was also the dominant interpretation of the First World War, that the multinational empires, seen as prison of the peoples, collapsed because of national aspirations leading to the creation of nation states. Studying borderlands helps challenge this perspective, and this is what I think is our common interest in our research, what we share as topic. In recent decades, and especially around the centennial of the fall of the empire, historians studying Central and Eastern Europe have increasingly focused on border areas between national territories, aiming to uncover the many segments of population who did not fit national identities promoted by national activists, or, as Peter Judson called them, guardians of the nation. So Peter Judson examined the language frontiers of Imperial Austria, Tara Zahra focused on Bohemian lands, and Brendan Karch, as you probably know, researched Upper Silesia, among other scholars also working on the same field. These historians use various terms to describe the persistent resistance to adopting national agendas. They call it sometimes national indifference, national fluidity, loyalty in Brendan Karch, and even sometimes they use older pejorative terms coined by national activists in their time, in 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, like regionalism, cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism was a negative characteristic given to people. Oh, he is cosmopolitan. He's not nationally aware. Or opportunism, which is a very important definition, which we'll turn back in our discussion. A common thread among these scholars is the idea that national belonging, especially in border regions, is never fixed, and even more importantly, that we can tell the history of these areas without speaking about nations. Several scholars have applied this new methodological framework to Rijeka, most notably Dominique Ryle in her book The Fiume Crisis from 2020. Ryle focuses on the lives of ordinary people who simply wanted continuity amid the upheaval, Her portrayal of Rijeka history largely omits the nuncio. She only mentions him at the beginning of her book for American readers and never again. She centers instead on the population's persistent loyalty to their established norms, habits, and the stability of the imperial past. Ryle does not see true national passion in their actions. Even in those who supported the annexation to Italy, she says, no, they were not so passionate Italians. They are not so Italianissimi. All those flags, slogans, and marches, she argues, were merely stage performances. According to her, the Italian National Council in Fiume supported annexation to Italy for pragmatic and economic reasons, using their Italian language and culture as a strategy to achieve their primary goals, and their primary goals were preserving autonomy and keeping some positive aspects of the imperial legacy. So they somehow wanted to keep the empire alive in their region. And this imperial good, positive imperial legacy also regarded legal system. There is one interesting example, and it regards the right to divorce. Hungary introduced the right to divorce in 1895. Almost 100 years later, Italy introduced the right to divorce. So Hungary introduced it in 1895, and it was only for Transylvania. After 1918, Rijeka's government chose to retain this law, the right to divorce, rather than adopting Italy's Catholic legal framework where divorce was unthinkable. In Habsburg Rijeka, during the empire, there were not so many divorces a year, about 40 divorces a year. But after 1918, the number of divorces rose sharply, reaching 466 divorces in 1922. How it comes? It was because a large number of Italian citizens were coming to Rijeka in order to get the divorce. Among them, there was Guglielmo Marconi, the Nobel Prize winner, inventor of the radio. He and his wife moved to Rijeka to take advantage of these divorce laws. So the Italian National Council, the Rijeka's provisional government was Italian National Council, insisted on keeping these progressive characteristics of the old legal system, resisting Italian laws. So how it comes that you want it so much to be annexed to Italy, but you don't want their laws, you don't want their money, you don't want their economy, you only want your autonomy. What kind of nationalism is this? This is Ryle's question. So from this point of view, the history of 1918 is not the history of the rise of nationalisms at all. This is a very convincing interpretation, but still it leaves some issues unresolved, and these issues reflect my broader concerns with the theory of national indifference itself. A central problem is that it tends to overlook power dynamics and the asymmetry between dominant and minority political options. Those who aligned with the dominant political view, which in this case was the annexation to Italy, could afford to present themselves as cosmopolitan, tolerant, moderate, or indifferent. But this is what we call imperial cosmopolitanism. They were still imperialists. They still felt as superior, civilizational superior. On the other side, those resisting dominant politics or advocating for minority causes, such as annexation to Yugoslavia, often had to adopt a firm identity or even embrace essentialized ethnicity as a defense. This distinction closely resembles that between thick and thin emotions in anthropology, or between ethnic and civic nationalism, or, as Brendan Karch says, drawing on Max Weber, between value-driven nationalism and instrumental nationalism. So we have, on one side, this relaxed, tolerant, open approach, and on the other side, kind of fanaticism. The risk here is to consider thin emotions, civic sense of belonging, and instrumental nationalism as inherently superior. And it's not the case that most often it's the scholar's point of view, so he himself considers himself as superior. So my choice to focus on the Croatian and Yugoslav communities was motivated by the dominance of Italian nationalist narratives in the memory of Rijeka's 1919. And I wanted to challenge the image of a happy revolution. This was my first goal. I wanted to highlight the experience of those who saw it as a violent occupation. So I focused on the Croats and other pro-Yugoslav, thus people who were not nationally indifferent. And my sources come from people with different educational backgrounds. Some were highly educated public figures and, we could say, national activists, while others were not. Yet also the others made political choices that were not merely opportunistic. Many chose or were compelled to remain Croatian even at a significant disadvantage. And what I want to stress here, they all had an explicit political position. However, while studying them and their texts, I could clearly see what theorists of national indifference had in mind. This sense of national belonging of my authors was neither stable nor absolute, but changed according to historical and political circumstances as well as individual responses, often with significant emotional fluctuations. My sources include, I will not dwell on this theoretical, we can discuss maybe later about the theory and concept of history of emotions I used. However, I worked on sources that included journals, diaries, private correspondence, and literary works. And this is another difference between maybe me and the scholars of national indifference, because the scholars studying national indifference usually rely on court and police reports, statistics, and other sources typical for social history. In contrast, the fact that I focused on written text maybe or probably make my research closer to the constructivist theory of nation, Anderson and so on, which are not very much considered by the theorists of national indifference. And here I can only briefly summarize the emotions and narrative expressions I found in my sources. I will illustrate each emotion with at least one document in which it appears. So I would like to start with a feeling that is not so directly connected to the sense of national belonging, boredom, and anxiety that comes with it. One of the most revealing sources on this sense of boredom, emptiness, endless waiting is a diary by a young lady, young woman named Zora Blažić, who lived in Rijeka, and the diary is preserved in the Rijeka History and Maritime Museum. She came from a modest bourgeois family. Her father owned a shoe shop. They were Croatian citizens of Rijeka, and the diary is written in Croatian, but like most residents, they were multilingual, speaking Croatian, Italian, and German. She attended the domestic skill school in Linz, and so on. She was engaged, but her marriage was postponed because her parents didn't want to spend money until their finances stabilized after the war. So in a sense, the whole family was waiting for things to return to how they were before. They weren't just waiting for the marriage. They were waiting for the war to finally end, for the negotiations to bring a solution, for the life to start again. Their lives had been structured by the rules of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and now they hoped that this familiar order and normality could return. Boredom is mentioned on almost every page of the diary. It's also because of her age, probably she is about 17, 18, an adolescent. She does not ignore the event happening in the city. She writes about the Allied administration, the Nuncio's occupation, gathering in the streets, the show that was going on, and the rise of national passions. But she, like her family and like many other citizens, just waits for the chaos to pass. The second emotion I want to discuss is enthusiasm for national identity, so that passionate sense of belonging to a larger community. And I must immediately clarify that in the emotional community I studied, this enthusiasm had its limits. And Zora Blažić is a good example again. In November 1918, during the brief Croatian administration of the city, she gradually emerged from her state of melancholia and began engaging in public expression of national sentiment. She joined marches advocating for annexation to the state of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. She was thrilled when their gatherings were as numerous as those by Italians, and so on. But however, this enthusiasm never becomes the dominant emotion in her diary. It doesn't take much for her to return to her usual melancholia, and shortly afterwards she writes, "I'm tired of all this noise." So she only after that turns to her indifference, we could say. And the same holds true for my other sources. There was indeed a strong will to join the state of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, but Croats from Rijeka were used to a multilingual and multicultural environment where they had always been a weaker part. And this was probably the reason for which they were not inclined to extreme national enthusiasm. It may have been a strategy of those without power, an instinctive sense that it was wiser not to exaggerate, not to provoke, not to stand out too much. And furthermore, there is another reason for which this enthusiasm has its limits. In their national beliefs, they were rooted in the Croatian national revival, in Croatian 19th century, based on historicism, basically. And this was quite different from the new Yugoslav mythology based on oral poems and the legendary heroes of the battles against Turks. This new Yugoslav narrative was distant from them. They could adopt it for political reasons, but it was a rational choice, not a matter of the heart. Anthropologically speaking, it was a thin sentiment, not a thick one. So it was, of course, an expression of modernity, this new national Yugoslav mythology, but they were people of the century, of the 19th century. So the Croatian exiles from Rijeka published a newspaper, L'Adriatico Jugoslavo, in Italian. They lived in Zagreb and they published this newspaper in Italian in order to reach Italian readers in Rijeka and also in Italy. This was their ambition, not realized, but however, this was their goal. And this journal is an excellent source for studying their community as an emotional community, as I try to show. And the range of emotions expressed in the journal is particularly wide. The first thing to note is that they had a deep appreciation for Italian culture, especially for the Italian Risorgimento, which they saw as a reminiscence of their own national revival, but with a happier ending, because the Italians managed to found their own national state in the 19th century, which Croatians did not succeed. So when it comes to love for national culture, we could say that these people admired and embraced both Italian and Croatian culture. They were certainly more familiar with Italian language and culture than with Croatian and Serbian medieval oral epics about Turks. However, this administration was met with profound disappointment when faced with the nuncio's enterprise, which, as I mentioned, aimed to portray itself as the continuation of the Risorgimento, as I said, the completion of the Risorgimento, the last part missing in the national territory. The Risorgimento, which through Mazzini had once promoted solidarity among oppressed nations, was now being used as a backdrop for an imperialistic act. So love and disappointment intervened here. Secondly, Croatians in Rijeka were outraged by the display of anti-Slavic racism, especially when they came from former friends or even family members. It was impossible to understand the national identity from origins, from surname, from language one was speaking. And often within the same family, one person might decide to be identified as Croatian and while another as Italian. But this latter choice often brought advantages in terms of career or financial prospects and so on. So this is a typical example of opportunism as a form of national indifference. So I'm indifferent, so I will choose that option which is better for me. However, it also became a way to assert, in this case, in Rijeka's case, a way to assert cultural superiority over other family members who remained Croatian. In these asymmetrical relationships, changes in national identity could not occur without conflict and bitter reactions from those who, for various reasons, choose not to change their identity. It provoked outrage, accusations of betraying one's roots. And this idea of roots led them to view their identity as a matter of blood and soil, even though they too were deeply embedded in both cultures. But once these identities began to become exclusive and considered as a question of blood, a thick emotion, the process was difficult to reverse and rapidly evolved into heavier feelings like resentment, hatred, and in this journal, we can, in other memoirs and diaries, we can find evidence of militant nationalism, chauvinism, hostility towards Italians, anti-Italian racism, aggression, and a desire for military conflict. This was no longer the cautious response of a weaker side in the conflict I described before. It was a mirrored reaction that fueled social and political developments, pushing toward militarism and authoritarian regimes akin to fascism, which finally happened between the two wars. After D'Annunzio left the city, Rijeka was governed for a couple of years by the Autonomist Party, but it was only a kind of transition towards a definite annexation to fascist Italy in 1924. Among the pro-Yugoslav residents who remained in the city, a sense of resignation and depression prevailed. And this brings me to the case of Rikard Lenac and his sister Gemma Harasim, a case that I think is paradigmatic in many ways. Gemma and Rikard were born to the same mother and grew up as very close and loving siblings. The particularity is that, due to the family circumstances, Rikard identified himself as Croatian, while Gemma identified as Italian. Both were prominent figures in the city. Before the war, Gemma was a teacher and pedagogue. Rikard was a writer, and Rikard was a lawyer who, at the end of the First World War, briefly served as mayor of Rijeka before being removed and expelled by the Italian City Council. And he later served as an advisor of the Rijeka question at the Paris Peace Conference. They clearly do not fit the profile of commoners often examined by scholars of national indifference, where national identity is viewed from below. They are not this kind of case study. And neither were they nationally indifferent in the strict sense of the term. They clearly identified themselves with the two different national groups. But the way in which they did it, the awareness of the contingency of their choices, their openness to the other culture made them so different from the nationalists of that time that they seem, in a way, indifferent. And let me illustrate it with some examples from their writings. While in Paris, as I said, he was advisor at the Paris Peace Conference. Rikard wrote a letter to his family, and the letter was written in Croatian. At the end of the letter, however, he added a few lines in Italian for his youngest daughter, saying, "My dear Nelly, you will not understand this letter. Ask your sisters to translate it for you. I had to write in Croatian because now we all have to be good Yugoslavs. Your dearest Daddy." So this perfectly illustrates his sense of national belonging. It was a cultural, linguistic, and political choice that did not erase this connection to Italian culture and language. There is no doubt that he was a Croatian and a Yugoslav nationalist. But in this case, the term coined by Dominic Ryle for the 19th century Dalmatians seemed appropriate: nationalists who feared the nation. Or in other words, they were nationalists, yes, they were, but they felt the destructive potentiality of nationalism. Something about Gemma in 1909 published an article, a series of articles in Florence journal La Voce, where she describes Italian nationalism in Fiume. She describes their flags, their historical myths, renaming streets after Italian heroes, and she says they are ridiculous. For her, socialist internationalism was the only way out of nationalist conflicts, and similarly, in his brief tenure as mayor, Rikard promised equal rights for all nationalities and was inspired by the principles of the French Revolution. So they had not only clear national political option, but also social ideas very clearly and explicit. So the impression, so neither of them could accept the brutality of the new era. Ricard in particular showed clear signs of depression in his private writings. And my impression is, or we can say, we all can have the impression that is that of two people from the world of yesterday. They belonged to the world of yesterday. So this was the end of an era. The multinational fabric of Rijeka was destroyed for the first time, and it would happen again after the Second World War, when the Italian citizens would leave and people from across Yugoslavia would arrive to fill the empty places, so new historical traumas would be inscribed onto the city. After the First World War, it was Italianized, and after the Second World War, it became only Croatian or Yugoslav city. So to conclude, I have tried to tell the history of this period through a spectrum of emotions, and my aim is to show that national belonging encompasses a wide range of emotions that are not visible from the census data. Census data are useful for tracking changes in national affiliation, but they give us a limited either-or view of belonging. So opportunism is very clear in these changes, but we don't have the touch of this wide spectrum of emotions. What I want to say is that between the fanaticism of the guardians of the nation on one end and the indifference, opportunism, or loyalty to any state on the other, there exists a plethora of emotions, and not every form of national belonging is extreme. It can involve being tired of nationalistic displays, appreciating another culture, speaking another language, and still holding political views on national, social, and territorial questions. So the group I studied was not indifferent to national identity, nor to social issues, but they also didn't share a single uniform sense of national identity. So this is an open question for me, and I really hope that in the discussion you may help me to solve this problem, because studies about national indifference are the mainstream, probably, as I can see it from my Northern Adriatic perspective. And I can't solve these issues with their methods. I think they leave too many questions open. So thank you, and we can just continue. Thank you very much.
Is there a rich archive of visual materials? Where is it? And did you explore that? And how to explore emotions, how to read emotions from photos and visual materials? Is it difficult? Or is there a range of emotions you can compare? Yeah, this is very difficult question and very broad, but let's try.
First of all, is there enough visual material? There is too many visual material since when D'Annunzio left the city, he took all the material with him, and the photographs went with him, so it was all in his luxury residence Vittoriale degli Italiani, which is on Lago di Garda. Yes, I think. No, Como. Okay, sorry. I will check and tell you later. There is a huge archive there. It's accessible, and very good archivists work there, so you can have their help. And for publishing those sources, it's more difficult because you have to have their permission, and their permission is based on the interpretation you give to your material. So they must have first judge your interpretation and then decide if they will permit you to publish it or not. The second thing, visual. The problem is, from your point of view, is that the majority of the photos are staged photos. And we always have this impression. This is why this idea of happy revolution is so strongly based on documentary material, because nobody went to take photos of normal people, but everybody wanted to take photos of legionaries who were posing and with strange uniforms in strange exhibitions of their bodies and so on. So this first topic of fascism and bodies starts in Rijeka. Actually, many other things of fascism started in Rijeka. Visual, like those kind of hats, parts of uniform, and some gestures and so on. Some slogans, "Eia, la la," was invented by D'Annunzio and his extraordinary sense of poetic verse. What about emotions in the photos? In the stage photos, it's very difficult consider stage photos as a source of history of emotions, but it is true that history of emotions works a lot on photographic, on photos from different historic periods, and it was my choice to use only texts as a source. I didn't work on photos because I don't have tools, methodological tools to work on it. But the book by Jan Plumper, I quoted on PowerPoint, is an excellent source, is an excellent guide, I would say, to the history of emotion, methodological history of this interesting field. So that's it.
Thank you so much for the lecture. It was quite educative. All right. So I've got a question about in terms of you expressed so much in terms of the emotional side of as an indication of how you can identify whether people were belonging or they had a sense of belonging in this, what's the name again, figure, like, what's the city name? Fiume, yeah. Fiume. Yeah, in Fiume, yeah. So now I'm asking myself this question to say, okay, if the emotions were showing that maybe other people in the early 1990s, 1919 to 1920, the Italians were the ones which were maybe it was more dominant within the Rijeka than the Fiume. Then also after the 1930s, you'd find that the Yugoslavia was more of like taking over in terms of
after the Second World War.
After the Second World War, yeah.
Yes.
All right, but my question lies in terms of each nation has got a sense of, maybe they've got a vision that which it's working towards. Was this maybe disconnection in terms of who is at the helm or the population, in terms of whether it's now the Italian within the 1990s and after the World War II, when the Yugoslavia was in place? Did it affect the vision of the nation and how people would want to work as a nation? Why I ask this, there is a moment when you told us about Ricard, and you said maybe he moved to France, where he was advising there. So for me, as an immigrant, it's an indication where you feel like, yes, you belong here, your heart is here, but you are not being part and parcel of the vision. Then you'd rather go and contribute somewhere else, and where you feel you can be heard and add more value to it.
Thank you. That's a very complex question. I must just say that Ricard was in Paris for only serving as an advisor for Rijeka questions, so he was there as a convinced pro-Yugoslav diplomat. So it was not a kind of immigration. He emigrated from Rijeka to Zagreb, so he remained within the borders of the state of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Yes, the question of this development of national identity is very interesting around the Second World War, as you mentioned, but this is maybe another topic. I can tell you just briefly that there is this kind of being proud of cities' specificity, this regionalism is a particularity that we can find in many cities. Trieste is one of them. In Trieste there is a saying, vogliamo l'Italia ma non vogliamo pagare le tasse. We want Italy but we don't want to pay taxes. So this is we are something special. It's very common, and I imagine that in Polish territory you can find areas where similar feelings are felt. However, the force of national center or motherland or fatherland is so strong that sometimes it's quite typical that they feel the borders not as mixed regions where national belonging becomes weak, but on the contrary, as the walls and strong borders of the nation, where antemurale Christianitatis for Croatian says. The Italy's eastern border is the most emotional border of all. Italy is not so much concerned with its northern or western border, but eastern border, which separates it from Slavs, is particularly emotional for Italians. So, to go back to your question, how the national sentiment evolved, it developed towards the unification with the national belonging, the sense of national belonging in the center, national center. And we have the case of Italians who left after the Second World War. They felt strongly Italian because it was after 2 decades of fascist rule. So they left the new Yugoslav state because of many reasons, but also because they didn't want to find themselves in a Slavic country. Some of them remained, and those who remained were those who mainly those who believed in the socialist project, in Yugoslav socialist project. So they were anti-fascist. Very often they had participated in the war with the partisans. We have Italian brigades, partisan brigades, and so on. So they left, and this is I would say, the nucleus of Italian minority in Yugoslavia, anti-fascist and pro-socialist. Today's Italian minority is mainly oriented towards Italy. After 1990s, they identified themselves with Italian country, and with the government we have now in Italy, it causes also some tensions, and I would say also embarrassments on both sides in Rijeka. Rijeka's specificity and cosmopolitanism was not so aware among Croats. So I told you the history of Italians and their national belonging, which was going more and more towards the recognition of Italy as motherland. For Croats living in Rijeka, Rijeka was only Croatian. During the Cold War, during Yugoslavia, there was little mention or not mention at all of the exodus of Italians after the Second World War. This started to being open in the 80s. Some writers, through the literature, it entered the public debate, and some writers introduced this topic in the public space. And about 1985, Rijeka, through literature and theater, some theater shows, suddenly became aware of its multiculturality and multilinguistic past, of its regionalism and particularity, on its being different from the rest of the motherland, and it was a kind of awakening of Rijeka's proudness. But there is also in the other side, the darker side of this, that regionalism from 90s onward becomes another label, another trend to follow, like in Istria or in Rijeka, we are different, so we are not nationalists. And this is the same speech of the national indifference. We are better because we are indifferent. It's a paradox to say a thing like that, because if you consider yourself better, then you're a kind of nationalist or racist. So we have this, different path of Italian community and Croatian community. This different, depends on, of course, on the government they lived under. But I hope I have answered your question.
Thank you. Thank you for your fascinating lecture. I would like to ask if you have done research on the emotions of the Italians, in the interwar period, of Italians originating from Rijeka, because it's interesting for me how they experienced the new state, because Rijeka experienced a big change from being a very important city, I think the second important city of the Hungarian kingdom, towards the provincial town of the Kingdom of Italy. And how Italians experienced it, that change. And the second question is about the figure of D'Annunzio as a hero. Is he present now among the Italian minority in Rijeka as a hero or anti-hero? This is, well, yeah, and is D'Annunzio present in the city space in Rijeka somehow?
Okay, thank you. I haven't researched about Italians in the interwar period, but there are works on this period by Vanni D'Alessio, an excellent scholar from Rijeka. So he studied the interwar period and the history of multilingualism, which is not anymore a multilingualism. Rijeka becomes only Italian city, but he studied how Croatian survived in some niches and didn't disappear. So Croatian citizens who remained in Rijeka continued to live and to speak their language. This is the research by Vanni D'Alessio. D'Annunzio for the members of Italian minority in Rijeka is a question of embarrassment. Yes, they don't want to offend their other co-citizens. They want to offend Croatian citizens of Rijeka. They understand. They don't want to. This is now the strategy I mentioned before for Croatians when they were a minority. The strategy of the minority not to stand up to, not to speak too loudly. So they have been quite cautious and tactful during the celebrations of the centennial, and when the neo-fascists from Italy came to make their performances in Rijeka on 12 September of 2019, they helped very much in preventing happening those events. So yes, the minority mentality is particularly interesting. I'm now belonging to Slovenian minority in Trieste, so it is from 20 years now. It has been for me a new experience, and I think it's very valuable for a person to find himself or herself sometimes as part of minority in her life. So yes, Italian minority in Rijeka is somehow turned apart from this, the influence of Italian government, the necessity of everyday life with their Croatian friends, and D'Annunzio, they see him as yes, an embarrassing topic. There was an interesting case found out by a journalist of one legionary, D'Annunzio's legionary, who remained in Rijeka because he fell in love with a Croatian girl. And he remained in Rijeka secretly from the other legionaries and from D'Annunzio himself. And now he has his descendants of third generation of D'Annunzio's legionary in Rijeka in a mixed family, Italian-Croatian family. So these are these nice stories from that history tells us. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your inspiring, fascinating lecture. I have just one question. How the Rijeka question was important for relationship between Ustasha movement and Mussolini regime before the Second World War?
Okay, first I have to say that D'Annunzio had in mind in his political, he was not a politician, but he was a poet and a manipulator. But he wanted to strengthen some contacts with Stjepan Radić, the Peasants' Party, in order to convinced Croatian not to enter Yugoslavia but to join Italy. He wanted somehow to defend or save Croatians from Yugoslavia. So this is sometimes mentioned in the history of these 2 years of the Nuncio's occupation as something that should, that the Croatian nationalists of today should like. Of course, there is nothing to like about it, because his goal was to annex Rijeka to Italy and nothing else. Rijeka was Italian, and as you know, Ustasha didn't have many problems to sell Dalmatia to leave all Dalmatia to big parts of Dalmatia to Mussolini. So Rijeka was out of question. It was clearly Italian between the two wars. Ustasha never mentioned, as far as I know, Rijeka's question. They never asked Mussolini to give them back Istria, for example. This is a strong argument of the anti-fascists today, in Croatian anti-fascists today.
Were there women among legionaries or not?
Yes. Their relationship to women was ambivalent. On one hand, they wanted to be very avant-garde and very modern, and liked emancipation, promoted emancipation, but actually when we studied their history, the history of this group of people, there were single female figures. Some of them were also entered the Italian National Council, so the government of the city. Single figures. On the other hand, we have extreme masculinism among them in their memoirs. One of them wrote after 6 months of the occupation, all women of Fiume are potrošene, are used. So we have already exploited all women of Rijeka. So they have this macho, superior, of course, the Nuncio's Nietzschean philosophy, masculinism, superhumanism, and so on. So there is also an interesting question of history of prostitutes in Fiume, because since there was a lot of prostitution in Fiume, because those girls were hungry and they went from Sushak to Fiume to work to be able to eat. There was nothing funny or nothing any kind of party in that kind of social phenomena. Dominique Ryle studied that aspect, and this is more or less her conclusion. So they used women, and there was nothing emancipatory or egalistic in their idea of women. So although they proclaimed themselves as progressive, and there were some militaries, some women who wore uniforms and used weapons. So this was considered a sign of modernity or progressivism, but actually they were very patriarchal.
Thank you, Natka, one more time. Thank you for coming today.